2 nights ago, a single gunshot had echoed from the eastern canyons. It wasn't a hunter's shot. The sound, dry and decisive, was more like a verdict. Jacob Thorne had tried to ignore it, to dismiss it as a trick of the wasteland. But his intuition, honed by 3 years of solitude, told him otherwise. He knew something had broken out there. A pact had been torn, a life extinguished. He just never expected that the broken pieces of that tragedy were now finding their way to his door, bringing the shadow of the one who pulled the trigger along with them. For 1,000 days, the only movement on Jacob Thorne's horizon had been the heat shimmer rising from the cracked earth. But today, there were 6 living things. They were no mirage born of thirst. He had rubbed his eyes until they stung, and still they remained. 6 figures of women kneeling in a silent line just outside his barbed wire fence, where his world ended and the endless waste began. The July sun was a hammer on the valley, turning the air to a furnace. From his porch, Jacob's hands tightened. On the weathered oak post, 3 years. 3 years since he'd taken his own vow of silence, a penance known only to him and his ghosts. He had built this solitude, board by board, wire by wire, turning his ranch into a fortress against the world of men. No one came here by accident, and these women did not look like they had simply lost their way. They were a tableau of ruin. Their dresses, perhaps once meant for a Sunday social, were now just tattered rags clinging to their frames. The youngest, still a girl, her face a mess of grime and dried tears. The eldest was perhaps just past 20, but the terror in her eyes added a decade. Jacob's throat was dry. Every instinct, honed by long days of solitude, screamed at him to turn his back, to bolt the door and let the desert swallow them as it had swallowed everything else. He had learned the hard way that compassion was a luxury he could no longer afford. Its price was always paid in blood and regret. The only safe place was alone, always Dot, but then one of them, her hair the color of dying embers, lifted her head. Her green eyes, though weary, held a desperate defiance he had spent years trying to forget. Her lips parted, but only a dry rasping sound escaped, the sound of a well-running dry Dot, and in that moment, a fissure cracked through the stone wall he had built around his heart. A long-buried feeling began to stir. The feeling that, perhaps, running from the world was not the same as being safe from it. The woman pushed herself to her feet, her thin frame swaying like a sapling in a high wind. She took a single faltering step toward him. The words she was about to utter would be more than just a plea. They would be a reckoning. They would shatter the silence he had worn as armor and prove that the solitude he'd mistaken for a sanctuary was about to become the most dangerous place on earth. Her voice, when it came, was a dry rustle of leaves and dust. Mr. You've got to help. There are men. They're hunting us like animals. The word hunting hung in the hot air, a cold, violent word that didn't belong here. Jacob felt his invisible walls tremble. This is no place for you, he called back, his own voice a stranger in his ears, rough with disuse. I've got nothing for you here. Even as he spoke the words, his eyes were recording the details his mouth denied. The gashes in their clothing were not from thorns or wire. They were deliberate, violent tears. And the stains, they were the color of old rust, the unmistakable mark of shed blood. The other 5 women were a mirror of their leader, a gallery of abuse and exhaustion. The woman took another step, her hand clutched to her ribs. When she pulled it away to gesture toward him, Jacob's breath hitched. A fresh, crimson flower was blooming on the ruined fabric of her dress. She was bleeding out, right here in his yard. They took our wagon 3 days ago, she gasped, her voice weaker now. Our man ... our guide. They shot him down without a word. She swallowed hard, her eyes flicking to the horizon behind her. They said ... they'd do worse when they found us again. Her eyes locked on Jacob, and he could see the weight of 3 days of running in them. Mister, you're all that stands between U.S. and the border, the last soul. The word border hit Jacob like a fist. These weren't just travelers in distress. They were fugitives. The trouble they carried would become his trouble the moment he offered them a sip of water. But as he watched the woman sway on her feet, her face growing paler, something inside him broke. To send them away now would be the same as signing there. Death warrants himself. The words drained the last of her strength. Her eyes rolled back and her legs gave way. She crumpled to the earth, a slow, boneless fall into the dust she had just preyed on. The other women, forgetting their own weakness, rushed to her side. And it was then that Jacob heard it. Not a sound from the women, but from the land itself. A low, percussive drumming carried on the wind from the east. Hoofbeats, many of them, riding fast and hard over the sun-baked plain. A fresh wave of terror washed over the women's faces, more potent than their pain or thirst. They knew that sound. 3 years of solitude fought against a lifetime's instinct. The vow he'd made to himself warred with the sight of the bleeding woman and the sound of an approaching judgment. The vow lost. Before his mind could raise another argument, Jacob's boots were on the dusty ground, moving toward them. Jacob reached the collapsed woman, his shadow falling over the small, desperate huddle. "Get her up." His voice was a low growl, an order, not a request. "Into the cabin, all of you. Move." The cabin swallowed them. For 3 years, this single room had been his entire universe, a Spartan space of wood smoke, solitude, and the smell of gun oil. Now, it suddenly felt like a cage, crowded with the scent of fear and desperation. The 6 women collapsed onto his cot, the floor, the lone chair, any surface that would hold their weight. The woman, Ilara, propped against the wall with a blood-soaked rag pressed to her side, scanned the room. Her eyes took in the single bedroll, the dusty table, the utter lack of a woman's touch. "You live alone," she stated, her voice thin but clear. "By design," Jacob said, his back to them as he bolted the heavy door. He moved to the window, peering. Through a crack in the shutters, the dust cloud on the horizon had grown, no longer a smudge but a churning, angry fist. "Who are they?" he demanded, his hand reaching for the long rifle resting on its pegs above the hearth. Ilara's face went ashen. The word she spoke was a poison on her tongue. "Slavers," she whispered. "They call themselves retrievers, men who trade in flesh." Her voice broke. "They promised us jobs. Decent work. Said we'd be governesses. Laundr, ses. She gestured weakly at her bruised throat. The gesture said more than words ever could. Outside, the drumming of hooves was closer now, the sound of an approaching judgment. Jacob could distinguish individual riders, at least half a dozen, moving with the cold efficiency of men who were masters of their dark trade. Ilara struggled to sit up straighter, a fire igniting in her weary eyes. "There's more," she rasped. As Jacob checked the rifle's action, the familiar click of metal on metal a cold comfort. "Something you have to know." She took a shaky breath. "The man leading them, he's not just some outlaw, he wears a star." Jacob froze, the rifle suddenly heavy in his hands. A star, a badge. That changed the equation entirely. It meant there was no law to appeal to, no higher authority to call upon. The law was the wolf at the door. "His name is Wade Garrett," Ilara said. And the name fell into the silence of the cabin like a coffin lid slamming shut. A voice cut through the oppressive heat, smooth as polished stone, but with an edge of chipped flint. "Oh, the house. U.S. Marshal's office. We're tracking a half-dozen thieves. Stolen property. They passed this way?" Jacob stepped out onto the porch, the screen door groaning shut behind him. He held the long rifle loosely, its weight a familiar burden. The 6 men sat their horses in a loose semicircle, a pack of wolves waiting for the signal. The man in. The center wore a black vest and a glinting star, Wade Garrett. Haven't seen a soul. Jacob's voice was flat, the voice of the valley itself empty and unchanging. Just the heat and the dust. Garrett's smile didn't reach his eyes. They were cold, calculating chips of obsidian. That so? Funny thing about this country, it swallows people up. Sometimes they need a little not help hiding. He dismounted with a fluid motion, his spurs jingling a sinister tune on the hard packed earth. You look like a man who values his privacy, friend. A man with things to forget. What is it you're forgetting out here? From within the cabin came a faint, sharp gasp of pain. It was barely a whisper, but in the dead stillness, it was as loud as a gunshot. Garrett's head snapped up, his smile vanishing. What was that? Wind rattling a loose shutter? His hand was already a blur, drawing the Colt from his hip as he took the porch steps in 2 strides. I think your house has secrets, Hermit. Let's have a look. As Garrett reached for the door, the long, dark barrel of Jacob's rifle rose to meet him, stopping an inch from the star on his vest. The metallic click as he cocked the hammer was the only sound in the world. I said, Jacob repeated, his voice no longer empty but filled with a cold, deadly weight. You haven't seen a soul. Garrett froze. His eyes narrowed, scanning Jacob's face, digging through the years of sun and beard. And then, a sick light of recognition dawned. Well, I'll be damned, Jacob Thorne. The yellow-bellied husband from Willow Creek. I wondered where you crawled off to. He sneered, a cruel twist of his lips. This is just like that day, isn't it, Thorne? Except this time there are 6 of them, and your wife, what was her name? Sarah. She screamed your name, you know. Begged for her brave husband to save her while you were running with your tail between your legs. A raw, furious scream erupted from the cabin, slicing through Garrett's words. It was Alara's voice, filled with a strength Jacob hadn't known she possessed. He's lying, Jacob. I was there. She didn't scream your name. She spit in his face and fought. She died cursing him. She died believing you would come. The world tilted under Jacob's feet. 3 years of guilt, a mountain of self-hatred, crumbled into dust in a single heartbeat. The image of his wife dying a coward's death vanished, replaced by the truth. A warrior's end. Garrett's face twisted with fury at the unexpected defiance. His own gun started to rise, but Jacob's rifle was already there. He wasn't avenging, ghost of his own making anymore. He was answering a promise. The rifle roared, a single deafening clap of thunder that echoed off the canyon walls. Wade Garrett was thrown backward off the porch, the star on his chest exploding in a bloom of crimson. For a single suspended moment, there was only the echo. Then the world erupted in a hailstorm of lead and splintered wood. Bullets chewed through the porch railing where Jacob had stood, shattering the windows of the cabin behind him. But Jacob was already moving, diving behind the heavy stone water trough at the edge of the porch. The 3 years of rust fell away from him like a snake shedding its skin. He worked the lever on the rifle, the motion as natural as breathing, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering a new round. The man who had sought peace had remembered the art of war. He fired, and one of Garrett's men spun from his saddle. But it was 5 against 1, and the math was unforgiving. Then, the cabin door flew open, not with a victim's fear, but with a warrior's fury. It was Alara. Blood still stained her dress, but in her hands she held Jacob's old double-barreled shotgun, its twin muzzles gaping like the gates of hell. She fired both barrels in a deafening roar of smoke and fire. The man closest to the porch was blasted from his feet. Over the ringing in his ears, Jacob heard her shout, her voice raw, "The cellar, Jacob, under the floorboards." It was a revelation. Moments later, the other women followed her lead, emerging from the darkness of the cabin, not as frightened sheep, but as a wolf pack. They carried his other rifles, his pistols, the ghosts of a past life he had hidden away. They were wounded, they were exhausted, but their hands were steady, and their eyes burned with the fire of those who had decided they would rather die on their feet than live on their knees. The fight that followed was not a long one. It was a vicious close-quarters slaughter. Caught in a deadly crossfire from the porch in the cabin, Garrett's men panicked. Their professional composure shattered. 2 more fell before they could untie their horses. The last 2 spurred their mounts wildly, riding for the horizon, not looking back. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The only sound was the wind whispering through the new holes in the cabin walls, and the panicked breathing of the living. In the yard, the dead lay still. Jacob found himself standing over Wade Garrett's body. The man who had been the architect of his 3-year nightmare was gone, his eyes staring blankly at the unforgiving sky. The victory felt strangely hollow. It couldn't bring back the dead. It couldn't erase the years he had lost to the prison of his own grief. Alara came to stand beside him, her silhouette framed against the blood orange of the setting sun. She had torn a strip from her petticoat to bind her side. The pain was still etched on her face, but the terror was gone, replaced by a quiet strength. She would be, Alara said softly, her voice carrying in the new silence. Proud, not because you killed him, but because you chose to stand. And now? Jacob asked, the words feeling foreign. He hadn't thought past the next heartbeat for 3 years. A small, weary smile touched Alara's lips for the first time. We talked in the dark, before they came. There's a settlement up in the Montana Territory. They're looking for teachers. Folks there are more interested in what you can do than where you came from. She paused, her gaze steady. And you, Jacob? She asked. Will you go back to listening to the ghosts in this valley? He looked around at the ranch, the cabin scarred with bullet holes, the silent barn, the endless fence stretching into the twilight. For 3 years, it had been his shield. Now he saw it only for the cage it was. The silence he had once craved now felt like an absence, an emptiness waiting to be filled. No, he said, the word coming with a certainty that surprised him. I think the ghosts have had their say. It's time to listen to the living. The winter snows came and melted, washing the blood from the dust of the valley. 6 months later, a new settlement nestled in a valley that greened with life. The sound of children's laughter rang from a 1-room schoolhouse. Jacob had built it with his own hands, the scent of fresh-cut pine replacing the old smell of gun oil and grief. Alara Thorne was the head teacher. On a bright spring morning, she and Jacob had married under a wide cottonwood tree. On her finger, she wore a simple silver ring that had once belonged to a woman named Sarah, not as a replacement, but as a continuation. A blessing passed from one strong heart to another. The other 5 women, their scars now faint lines telling the story of survival, taught alongside her. Some evenings, when the day's work was done, Jacob would stand on the porch of the new home he and Alara had built, looking out at the mountains. The quiet here was different. It wasn't an absence, but a presence. A peace. And sometimes, when the wind rustled through the aspens, he could almost hear a whisper. It wasn't a voice of pain or regret, but one of pride. A voice he now knew he had never truly failed.